heat waves, drought, tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, blizzards, bitter cold. Extreme weather has an incredible impact on people across the globe. On Mount Washington, our scientists brave some of the worst weather on the planet to improve our understanding of our warming world. All right, hello and good evening. Welcome everyone to Mount Washington Observatory's Science in the Mountains with program support from MathWorks. My name is Brian Fitzgerald and I'm the Director of Science and Education here at Mount Washington Observatory. And joining us this evening to discuss the very first scientific expedition on Mount Washington in winter is Dr. Peter Crane, who is the curator of the observatory's Gladys Brooks Memorial Library. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's program. For those of you who aren't already familiar, the Mount Washington Observatory is a nonprofit, member-supported organization whose mission is to advance the understanding of the forces that create Earth's weather and climate. And we accomplish that through operating our Summit Weather Station with around-the-clock weather observation and forecasting, by conducting research and product testing, and by developing and offering innovative educational programs. If you have questions for tonight's speaker, Dr. Crane, and are joining us via Zoom, please join us by using the Q&A button to add your question. You can find that down at the bottom of your toolbar at the video screen. We're able to collect your questions throughout the entire program, and we'll have some time at the end for a live Q&A session, so make sure to get your questions in. If you're joining us on the live stream on Facebook, welcome and thanks so much for being with us as well. While we won't be able to respond to your questions in the Facebook feed during our program, our Summit staff will try and respond as quickly as they can following. If you'd like to connect through Zoom for the next program, please register using the program link on mountwashington.org/SITM. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and launch a poll to introduce things here before we introduce our speaker for the evening, because we have a little bit of trivia for you. So if you're joining on Zoom, you should see this. Apologies if you're not able to join in if you're joining on Facebook. However, we have some poll questions, so go ahead and respond at your leisure here. Just give you a couple minutes to respond. We're curious, where are you joining us from this evening? We have a record number of folks joining who are clearly very excited about the topic, just like I am as well. And would love to know where you're joining: Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, Southeast, outside the country. Please let us know if you'd like. Curious if you're currently a member of the observatory. As I mentioned, the observatory is member supported. It's a critical part of our revenue to be able to operate around the clock and for a long time now. So let us know. Yes, no, no, maybe you'll consider after this excellent program. No, maybe you don't want to be a member, but you'll give a donation instead. And certainly we'd appreciate that too. All right, and then finally, a couple trivia questions from Dr. Crane himself. The minimum summit temperature noted by the Huntington-Hitchcock Expedition was what? Was it minus 36? Was it minus 47? Was it 59 degrees below zero Fahrenheit? Let us know what you're thinking. And then finally, the maximum summit wind recorded by the Huntington-Hitchcock Expedition was what? 105, 120, 186 miles per hour? Let us know. I'll let it go for just a few more seconds here, as I see quite a few of you still getting your responses in. And 3, 2, 1. All right, let's share some results. All right, overwhelmingly 84% of you are joining from the Northeast, but have no fear, we have representation from every other corner of the country, including a couple folks from outside the country as well. Thanks so much for joining. Certainly nice using this virtual setting to be able to bring you a little bit closer to the summit of Mount Washington this evening. All right, quite a few of you, in fact, almost the majority there, all told, are current members of the observatory. Thank you for your continued support. And then for the trivia, all right, it looks like most of you, 51%, went with minus 47 or 47 degrees below zero for an answer, and then 186 miles per hour. Interesting. Oh, interesting. Okay, well, I'll stop sharing the results there. And I want to kick things off by, well, let's introduce our speaker for the evening. So without further ado, Peter, we'd love to have you join. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine. Let me turn my camera on. There we go.
Excellent. I can see and hear you just fine. So
Why, that's a good thing.
why don't you take it away?
All right. Well, thank you very much, Brian. And I want to thank everyone who is participating this evening. Obviously, quite a large crowd of folks who are interested in learning more about the history of Mount Washington and of weather observations on the mountain. When I spoke with Brian leading up to the presentation tonight, I acknowledged that in terms of technology, I'm a bit of a dinosaur. I wouldn't call myself a Luddite, but actually this is the first time I've given a Zoom program, though I've had the pleasure of attending quite a few. And I thought it over and realized that I really had to stick my neck out, because back in 1870 and 1871, there was a small band of men who stuck their necks out to establish an outpost on top of Mount Washington for the cause of science. And the least I can do is to help share information and share knowledge and appreciation for the work that they did 150 years ago. So without further ado, let's move on to our program. And here we go, Breaking the Ice, the first winter scientific expedition to Mount Washington, celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Huntington-Hitchcock Expedition. And I'll say for clarification that back 150 years ago, they didn't call it the Huntington-Hitchcock Expedition. They just called it a scientific expedition. But I think it's appropriate to identify it by the two men who, above all others, conceived of it and made it happen. Nowadays, Mount Washington is visited year-round, even in its harshest season, when winter cold and winter winds rule the peak. Temperatures as cold as 47 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit and winds up to 231 miles an hour have been documented by the Mount Washington Observatory. The mountain in its coldest season is both alluring and forbidding, attractive in its austere beauty, but terrifying in the destructive potential of its extreme weather. Still, climbers will ascend the mountain at any time of year and try the trip in almost any weather, sometimes to their peril. Experience has demonstrated that rising to the mountain's challenges can offer great satisfaction, but failing to meet them can be dangerous, even fatal. That experience dates back now many decades, but that was not always the case. While the first recorded ascent of the mountain was in 1642, the climb in meteorological winter was not made until 1858, in early December of that year, and the first true winter calendar ascent was not made until February of 1862. So up until 1870, these two were the only known winter ascents of Mount Washington. For many decades now, the summit of the mountain has been occupied year-round, even in its harshest season, by the staff of the Mount Washington Observatory. And nowadays, that staff enjoys comfortable quarters in the state park's Sherman Adams building. But it was not always the case on the summit. While there have been very simple structures on the top of the mountain since the 1850s, those earliest structures were simple indeed, such as the Tip-Top House, still standing today, and the similar first summit house pictured here, long since removed. They offered minimal comforts even in their summer season and lay abandoned during the long, harsh winter. The Cog Railroad, now fueled by coal or biodiesel, chugs its way up and down the mountain from late spring to early fall, sometimes in wintry weather. But that was not always the case. The earliest cog engines were wood burners, and the mountain climbing technology which they pioneered was sound, but when the cog debuted in 1869, it was not yet proven in extensive field experience. Nowadays, not only do mountaineers hike up and down Mount Washington in winter, excuse me, but large and effective snow tractors, piloted by capable operators, make the trip up and down every week, weather permitting. But that was not always so. In the 19th century and well into the 20th century, the only method of winter transport up and down the mountain was on foot, always subject to the winds of wind, cold, fog, snow, and ice. Today, weather observers climb up their sturdy tower and keep the rime ice off their ever higher tech instruments to maintain their records of the remarkable weather atop Mount Washington. But this was not always so. For the earliest weather observers, lacking a sturdy tower or ice-resistant anemometers, manually held the wind instrument and exposed it and themselves to fierce gusts to measure them for science. This is today's weather observatory, with its tower jutting out from a solid concrete and steel building, which has withstood the elements now for more than 40 years. But this is the observatory of 1870, the first winter weather station, housed in one corner of a massive wooden building, newly built to serve as an engine shed for the Cog Railroad, a building as yet untested by the mountain's winter storms. Those who dreamed of a winter occupation of the highest peak in the Northeast and who turned that dream to a reality were these two men, Charles Hitchcock and Joshua Huntington. Charles Hitchcock was a geologist, son of Edward Hitchcock, who had served as state geologist of Massachusetts and was president of Amherst College. The younger Hitchcock had served as assistant state geologist of Vermont and as state geologist of Maine. At the time of the Mount Washington expedition, Hitchcock was 34 years old and serving both as a professor at Dartmouth College and as head of the New Hampshire Geological Survey. Hitchcock's principal assistant on the New Hampshire Geological Survey was Joshua Huntington. From Connecticut, Huntington attended Dartmouth and then graduated from Amherst College. His early work included geological work in Vermont, teaching in Mississippi, and involvement in the mining industry. At the time of the Mount Washington adventure, Huntington was 37 years of age. Hitchcock's Geological Survey of New Hampshire studied the state from Coos to the sea. It considered not only geological matters, but others touching on the physical geography and natural history of the Granite State, gold mining and granite quarrying, insects, plants, and diatoms, river systems and scenic landscapes, and much more. All were grist for the survey's mill and were featured in a massive 3-volume final report published from 1874 to 1878. It contained more than 2,000 pages. Mount Washington, of course, was included in the report, such as this map of the Mount Washington Carriage Road, today's Auto Road, and a geological section from west to east across the mountain. To give a broader representative view of the topography of the state, select panoramas were included in the remarkable large format atlas which accompanied the report, such as this panorama from Mount Washington. Other panoramas, such as from Mounts Carrigan, Chocorua, Tremont, and Pequawket, today's Kearsarge, were also included. Also in the atlas were splendid maps depicting the underlying geology of the entire state. This detail of the geology of the White Mountains region is certainly one of the more colorful of all those maps, a sterling example of the combination of the diligent fieldwork of the geologist and the creative art of the cartographer. Hitchcock and Huntington had developed a special interest in Mount Washington, and though geologists, their broader interest in earth sciences, and I believe their sense of adventure, stirred in them an enthusiasm for doing something that had never been done, to spend an entire winter atop the region's highest peak, establishing a weather station to accurately document the summit's weather extremes.
These technical difficulties, as you might suspect, being a dinosaur, I can say something like, I never had that problem with a carousel projector. But we'll go back to Hitchcock and Huntington. The two men had a great interest in returning to Mount Washington. However, the person who owned the Summit House and the Tip Top House really had no interest in having scientists occupy his small hotels in winter. And so the Mount Washington project had a trial run elsewhere, which was atop Mount Moosilauke in the western White Mountains, about 4,800 feet high, with a broad open summit, accessible, conditions permitting, via a simple carriage road. Atop the mountain was a small summit hotel owned by a man named William Little, a man who was much more friendly to scientists than his Mount Washington counterpart. Having heard of Hitchcock's and Huntington's interests, he invited them to use his building for their expedition, and plans were made for a 2-month occupation of the summit of Mount Moosilauke for January and February 1870. Hitchcock had professional duties that would keep him off the mountain, but Huntington would not be alone in his occupation. With him would be Amos Clough of Warren, New Hampshire. Clough was about 36 at this time. He was born in very modest circumstances, and though in an area where farming or a similar vocation would be his likely occupation, he chose instead to be an artist, or more specifically, a photographic artist. He would keep Huntington company, assist him in his meteorological observations, do some very hard work toting supplies up the mountain, and capture scenic views which he would feature on stereographs, such as this view of bringing brushy firewood up the Moosilauke Prospect House. I think it's fair to call the Clough stereo views from the winter on Moosilauke rare, as even avid collectors run into great difficulty trying to track them down. Doubtless the best assemblage of them is in a recent book by Robert Averill called In Search of Amos Clough, which is a wonderful biography of Clough, exploring his life and times. The book includes excellent reproductions of Clough's Moosilauke views, as well as his and Kimball's Mount Washington views. Harsh winter storms were a feature of the 2 months on Moosilauke. In one passage attributed to Clough, we read, "I was awake nearly all night. The wind moans, whines, shrieks, and yells like 1,000 ghosts. The house trembles and rocks, though the walls are made of stone 3 feet thick, and the roar is deafening. I shiver with cold and wet and tempest. Darkness, if not terror, reigns." That's pretty scary stuff. Reading such a passage, and knowing that one of Clough's motivations for spending time atop Moosilauke was to capture photographic views, which were not prominent when the summit was fog-bound, you understand why at one point he had a 2-week absence from the peak to attend to valley chores. But there were times atop Moosilauke that were very positive. What an experience for merely 2 months we have had up here. Storms, hail, rain, sleet, snow, and then what sunshine. How grand the 1,000 snowy mountain peaks around us. No mortals since the world began ever had such an experience on a North American mountaintop as we have had. I think he liked his time on Moosilauke, and he would like his coming winter experience on an even higher peak. After a fruitful and very informative experience in Moosilauke, Huntington and Hitchcock set their sights again on their original goal, Mount Washington, for the winter of 1870-71. But again, they were stymied. They were denied access to the Summit House and the Tip Top House. Building their own cabin was impractical. There were no other suitable buildings on the mountain, but there was word that a new enterprise on the mountain would be erecting a summit structure that summer. And for this scientific expedition, it was a case of the Cog Railway to the rescue. The Cog had its first run to the summit in 1869, and the railway realized that having an engine shed at the summit to serve as a depot for the train and its passengers was desirable. And so Huntington and Hitchcock approached the originator of the railway, Sylvester Marsh, to see if he would allow the scientists use of that proposed new building for service as a weather station.
The railway gave their okay to use the new building and provided transportation of supplies and equipment before winter closed in. And so the depot, well, a small portion of it became a weather station and served the summit crew well in that function. Sylvester Marsh and his company provided the all-important home to the expedition, without which the dream would have died a cold death. And through the winter, if a trip had to be made up and down the mountain, it was by walking along the cog tracks that the trip was made. Not an easy trip, but a direct route between valley and summit, and at many times the tracks were a guide to help in navigation. But there was more that was needed to establish that remote outpost, specifically funding, at first estimate to be the sum of $2,000, not a small sum in those days. And so Hitchcock sent out a circular soliciting donations to support the enterprise, not the first nor the last scientific project to struggle to find support. The circular and related efforts met with little success. Even when personalized by one of the expedition participants, such as this copy with features and entreaty from Howard Kimball, a Concord photographer who joined forces with Clough to visually document the expedition and its work. Professor Hitchcock informs me that I must raise $100 or $200 for my share, he wrote, which he accomplished. But the expedition needed more than a place to stay and more than funding. They needed a mission. And their mission was a meteorological one, to document the weather atop the mountain and to use that information to help forecast the coming weather. Hitchcock summed up their charge in a mission statement. Besides advancing science, commerce will be benefited greatly by these daily reports. As the farmer studies the cloud caps upon high mountains to forecast the weather, so telegraphic reports of the condition of the atmosphere upon the highest summit in eastern America will enable ship owners to judge of the approach of storms and escape risk of loss to their vessels by keeping them in the harbor till the danger is past. So, too, with fair weather reported from the mountain, vessels can get a day's start of any destructive storm, and in these ways an immense saving of property be effected. While spending a winter atop the mountain may have seemed a fool's errands to some, it could carry with it real and practical benefits. And so another partner joined in the endeavor, and that partner was headquartered in Washington, D.C. Based in the War Department, later to be called the Department of Defense, was the Signal Service of the United States Army. The Signal Service, responsible for the Army's communications via telegraph, had added on to its responsibilities that of collecting and transmitting weather information, and eventually issuing probabilities, basic weather forecasts. And it was on February 9th, 1870, 151 years ago today, that the Division of Telegrams and Reports for the Benefit of Commerce, acting under the Signal Service, was created by President Ulysses Grant. Partnership with the Signal Service was critical in establishing the Mount Washington Weather Station. While the Army could provide no funds for the project, it did provide a critical package of support: weather instruments, a telegraph set, 3 miles of insulated telegraph wire, which would be installed along the Cog Railway tracks, and most of all, Sergeant Theodore Smith, a trained weather observer and telegrapher, who became an integral member of the crew. This relationship allowed an efficient summit operation and provided the essential means to transmit current weather reports from the summit to the world below. And so in the fall of 1870, a crew of 5 men prepared for a remarkable scientific adventure on Mount Washington. Left to right, there was Sergeant Theodore Smith, 27 years old, born in Prussia, now serving his adopted country in uniform. Solomon Nelson, 36, a Civil War veteran and a farmer of Georgetown, Massachusetts, who offered his services to help fundraise for the expedition. He raised more than $800. Looking perhaps a bit out of place is Howard Kimball, 25, of Concord, a photographer who asked to join the crew and whose presence was welcomed by Amos Clough, seated next to him in this photo. When Clough and Kimble climbed to the summit in late November, their first such trip, Kimble nearly succumbed to the wind and cold, was only saved due to the extraordinary efforts of Clough. And finally, on the far right, Joshua Huntington, nicknamed the Professor, doubtless for his scholarly approach to the scientific tasks at hand. Hitchcock, alas, had professional responsibilities in Hanover that prevented much of a presence on the mountain, but he served as a critical valley liaison, reachable by telegraph. While the expedition was considered an adjunct activity of the Geological Survey, and some information about the expedition appeared in the survey's final report, the principal source of information about it can be found in the volume Mount Washington in Winter, which contains contributions from each of the participants. I mentioned the Cog Railway Summit Depot, which served as a home for the expedition. It was quite a large building, and when the crew fitted it out for their use starting in October, it was not yet finished. Here's a brief description. The building is constructed wholly of wood. It is 60 feet long by 22 feet wide and stands nearly north and south. It has 11 feet posts, and the elevation of the ridgepole is 25 feet. As you can tell, it was a very large building with quite a bit of exposure to the summit winds, and it was brand new. Would it last through a Mount Washington winter? While there was a very large doorway to allow entrance by a Cog Railway engine, that doorway was nailed shut for the winter. There was no real door to the building for the summit crew. A small opening, a hole in the wall, allowed entrance. The opening was evidently covered by a cloth to keep out the worst of the blowing snow. Boards were secured over the hole at night. Here, 3 of the crew pose for a photo. That black square is the entrance to their winter home. Here's a description of the weather station. The apartment occupied by the party is a room about 20 feet long, 11 feet wide, and 8 feet high. The inside of the outer walls was covered first with tarred paper, then with boards. A layer of sheathing paper was added, and wallpaper was spread upon this. The ceiling is formed of 2 thicknesses of board with sheathing paper between. So you have a sense of the construction of the station. It took up 1 corner within the larger building, with 2 walls common to the depot proper. And reading the description, you note the distinct lack of any insulation. This was in a location whose average midwinter temperature would be in the single numbers above 0 Fahrenheit. You can understand why not 1 but 2 stoves were installed in the station, and there were times that even with both burning hot, the small room was decidedly cold. This engraving of the interior of the station makes the place look roomy and comfortable, clean and neat. I think we can call this the artist's conception, since with up to 5 men living here at one time, with winter clothing, scientific equipment, and other gear, things were doubtless very tight. Here's a comment by one visitor. The little snuggery is made to serve not only as a kitchen, dining room, sleeping room, parlor, library, and study, but also as an observatory and telegraph office. Every inch of space is utilized. They all complain that it is the easiest place to lose anything in they ever saw. If you are familiar with, say, the rather congested crew room of an AMC hut, you probably have an idea of how cluttered this little place must have been. In this photo by Clough or Kimble, you probably get a better idea of how tight the space was. As close as the quarters may have been, the expedition narrative indicates that the crew members got along well. Also, not all members were present at all times. Huntington made a total of 17 trips up and down during the winter, attending to business in the world below. And Clough and Kimball were on the summit for the month of December, but having gotten some good negatives and realizing that the mountain's harsh weather limited their further opportunities, they then descended, only returning from time to time. Many of the views of Clough and Kimble captured the peculiar phenomenon of rime ice. Rime ice, as we now know, forms when tiny supercooled water droplets in clouds freeze when hitting an object. They can form marvelous sculptures, which then, as now, are beautiful and fascinating. This sculpture is a cairn that marks the spot where Lizzie Bourne died in 1855, succumbing to the elements only a few hundred feet from the shelter of the 2 summit hotels. And this photo shows the rime-covered first summit house. It was built in 1852, the first substantial building on the summit. After the building of the much larger second summit house, a real hotel, in 1873, the small structure was used as a dormitory for employees and was taken down in 1884. It stood not far from today's Observatory Tower. Clough and Kimball were also enthralled by the more distant views from the summit, when the typical summit fog and clouds gave way to views around the horizon circle, allowing glimpses of clouds below, of distant peaks, and sometimes the gleam of the Atlantic. While nowadays we would take such photos in color with very different equipment, these scenes of snow and ice, mountain and cloud, are not so different from the photographs we might take and enjoy today. And the aesthetic enjoyment too is similar today to that which that first summit crew experienced. As Huntington wrote early in his stay, when for a while he was the sole occupant of the summit, "Have been here above the clouds all day long. In every direction was this illimitable sea of clouds. Being here alone, one has nothing to do but to contemplate this immensity of space, bounded only by the sky." While a serious scientist, Huntington also doubtless savored the adventure of doing something challenging that no one had done before. In early November, before the arrival of the rest of the crew, he also wrote, "I am here alone, but should have come if I had known that I had to stay alone all winter." As we look at these photos from a century and a half ago, we can see that in some ways the summit environs has not changed all that much. You can see the Cog Railway tracks, the depot, the summit and tip-top houses, and today there are more and more substantial structures, but the rocks, snow, and ice remain. Huntington also commented on the nature of life and work atop Mount Washington. As he wrote, "Most persons suppose that life on Mount Washington in winter must be gloomy. However, if the time of any persons in excellent health is wholly occupied in a pursuit that is congenial, they are rarely gloomy. Here, besides good health and time occupied, there is an excitement found nowhere else." And perhaps there was nothing that provided as much excitement as observing the weather, especially the wind. There were no roof-mounted or tower-mounted anemometers in those days. Among other issues, there was no effective way to prevent rime ice from forming on them. So, at the time of the weather observation, 3 times each day, one of the crew had to bundle up, take the recording anemometer in hand, go outside, and lie down to expose the anemometers to take a full reading of the current wind. This is Sergeant Smith measuring the wind at 88 miles per hour. And here, an engraving of such an anemometer, very different from the tower-mounted, electrically heated pitot-static anemometer used on the summit today. From time to time, remarkable atmospheric or optical phenomena could be witnessed and enjoyed, such as a corona or the specter of the Brocken, or glory as it's known, also seen by observers today. And of course, rime ice, whether in the form of frost feathers or in other guises, continuously intrigued the summit crew. Today, we can capture the bright and varied colors of sunrises and sunsets in photographs, but that was a feat not yet practically achieved by Clough, Kimble, or other 19th century photographers. And so the members of the expedition painted their sunrise and sunset pictures with words, which showed that they had not only scientific interests and a sense of adventure, but also an appreciation for the aesthetic wonders of the mountain's winter landscapes. As Nelson wrote, "Mr. H. called us out before sunrise to see the beauty of the morning. In truth, it was wicked to miss such a glorious view as we had. Perfectly clear and nearly calm. Never before have I seen the shadow of the mountain so grand on the western sky, never so charming the purple tents at break of day." Of course, the primary purpose of the expedition was to document the mountain's remarkable weather. And so often in such endeavors, many hours of difficult work is distilled down to rows of numbers and pages of graphs. Here, Huntington compared the wind velocity of December 1870 with the barometric pressure of that same month and found a strong suggestion of a correlation between the two. Daily observations were taken at 7 a.m., 2 p.m., and 9 p.m. Parameters observed included temperature, presence of precipitation, and if so, what kind, cloud type and cloud amount, wind direction and speed, barometric pressure, and relative humidity. The highest temperature recorded during the 6-month project from mid-November to mid-May was 47 in April. The lowest was in February, -59. But Hitchcock acknowledged that the mercury thermometer was unreliable below -38. Peak wind speed was 105 miles per hour in mid-December, but the crew estimated that the winds had exceeded that, perhaps up to 120 miles per hour. Another product of the expedition were the Clough and Kimble stereo views. They threw in their lot together. There is no indication of which photos were snapped by Clough and which by Kimball. About 4 dozen different images were produced, only 2 interior shots, the rest of the summit, from the summit, or scenery in the nearby valleys. The production and marketing of the stereo views were probably handled by the Kimball studio in Concord, being well established in the field. Clough most likely considered this when happily accepting the inclusion of Kimball in the Mount Washington project. He probably also looked forward to the companionship of a like-minded colleague who shared his embrace of photographic art. As he wrote, summing up one of the aspects of his profession, it is the province of the photographer to bring to the eyes of the public that which is not of a readily accessible character, thus to give those who cannot visit such places a chance to see wonders and beauties while they enjoy the comforts of home, enduring none of the perils, dangers, or hardships which are necessary to get at the real. From the sublime to the ridiculous, the expedition also had to weather its share of skepticism and criticism. There were those who felt that the crew was doomed to disaster, which perhaps served them right for engaging in such a perilous enterprise. Here, a birch card basket given as a Christmas gift to Huntington, with inscriptions foretelling the tragic fate of the summit crew. Would they die of thirst? Would they starve to death? Would they run down the mountain when it storms? Would they be snowbound and die of suffocation? Would they be homesick and leave at the first opportunity? Fortunately, none of these prophecies came to pass. Some newspapers and journals had some pretty harsh things to say, such as, "A party of fossilized scientific maniacs are wintering on the top of Mount Washington. Much science has probably made Smith mad. Smith voluntarily took up his abode on Mount Washington, a course of conduct of which it is absurd to suppose that a sane person would be guilty. It is time that some charitable person should protect these unhappy persons from their own mad selves." But in spite of such criticism, the expedition was safe and successful. No significant injuries, no lost fingers or toes. Instead, winter photos from a noteworthy, even magical place that had only once before seen a camera in winter, and a winter's worth of meteorological reports as well. While the expedition left the summit in mid-May, the summit weather station was not abandoned. Impressed with the results of their work, the U.S. Army Signal Service picked up the baton and directly assumed responsibility for taking weather observations at the summit. At first, they used the small quarters in the Cog Railway depot, but in 1874, a separate building was erected on the summit, the signal station. And just as well, in March 1876, just 2 years later, a great wind destroyed the depot in which the expedition had been housed, smashing it to smithereens. The soldiers of the signal station continued some of the same rhythms of life which Huntington and his crew had, collecting rime ice to melt for water, working hard to keep the instruments functioning in harsh weather, repairing breaks in the telegraph wire. In this interior photo of the signal station, it even appears that the soldiers used the same stove which had kept the expedition warm, and which on the bitterest of nights barely kept the station above freezing. Their detailed meteorological observations reflect their diligence, and indeed, some of their data were used by European researchers to better understand the movement of currents in the upper air. But then, as now, from time to time, there were government budget cuts. The expense of operating mountaintop stations meant they came under special scrutiny. After the summer of 1887, the station was closed in winters and operated in summers only into 1892, when it closed permanently. The abandoned station was burned in the accidental fire which swept the summit in June of 1908. But that is not the end of the story. In 1932, these four men, Alex Mackenzie, Bob Monahan, Joe Dodge, and Sal Pagliuca, were inspired by the work of Huntington, Hitchcock, and their crew, and by the soldiers of the Signal Service who followed them. They resolved to re-establish a weather station on the top of Mount Washington in conjunction with an international scientific study of high altitudes and high latitudes. These are the founders of today's Mount Washington Observatory. For their mountain home, they had not a railway depot, but the summit stage office of the Mount Washington Carriage Road, which served them in good stead. Knowing that this endeavor was not a novel one, but rather inspired by those pioneers who had come before, Bob Monahan thoughtfully titled his book about that first winter, Mount Washington Reoccupied. And their timing was good. Less than 2 years after the observatory's founding, a wind of 231 miles per hour was accurately clocked atop the mountain, and that gust was considered the world's record wind for many decades thereafter. While the plan at first was to reoccupy the summit for just one winter, the success of the enterprise was so great that the occupation continued. In 1937, a building specifically for the use of the observatory was built, sometimes called the strongest wooden building on Earth. And in 1980, the observatory moved into the newly built State Park building, named for former New Hampshire Governor Sherman Adams. The efforts and achievements of Huntington, Hitchcock, Smith, Clough, Kimball, and Nelson should long be remembered here in the White Mountains. They are remembered in various place names, in Mount Clough, west of Moosilauke, in Nelson Crag on Mount Washington, in Huntington Ravine on Mount Washington, haunt of winter ice climbers and home to one of the toughest trails in the White Mountains, in the Hitchcock Flume on Mount Willard and Mount Hitchcock, north of the Kankamugas Highway in the Pemigewasset area. But most of all, those pioneers are remembered in the continuing meteorological activities, scientific research, and educational endeavors of today's Mount Washington Observatory. Thank you very much. And I will pass the baton, insofar as I can, back to Brian.
Peter, can you actually hear me okay?
I can hear you, Brian.
We're playing a little musical chairs this evening.
I guess we are indeed.
Yeah, thank you so much, Peter. And thanks for going with the flow here after suffering what looks like a catastrophic computer failure, no fault of your own. Wow, thank you so much.
Sure thing.
Obviously, a lot of history you covered there, a lot of questions that have been bubbling up as we go. My apologies, I may have missed some questions that have been submitted earlier on in the program since I had to swap computers here. And Peter, just to double check, yes. You can hear me okay, right?
I can hear you loud and clear, Brian.
Excellent. Well, let's get to some questions here because we have an opportunity for folks to ask some questions. I see some rolling in. As a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question of Peter, by all means, if you're on the Zoom program, you'll have the opportunity to do that. Just hover down on your Zoom screen to the Q&A button and you'll be able to type in a question there and we'll see if we can get to as many as possible. All right, you ready to go?
I'm ready.
All right, and you can stop sharing as well on your screen whenever you're ready.
Okay.
All right, let's see. Oh, Stephen asked a while ago, and this is a toughie, a question that comes up even today. At the time of the expedition, who owned the summit? It seems like there were different private parties with buildings on the summit at that time. What do you know about ownership back in 1870 of the summit of Mount Washington or even the surrounding region?
I would say that's a potentially complicated question. It was not, of course, that predates New Hampshire State Park, long predates the White Mountain National Forest, privately owned. And over the course of many years, there was quite a contest which had involved some litigation, eventually was settled regarding the ownership. if memory serves me correctly, there was quite a role there for the Cog Railroad, but I will have to do a little bit of further detailed research, and I can try to perhaps post something with your assistance to try to fine tune that. I would recommend to folks who have an interest, there is a great website called whitemountainhistory.org. And if you take a look there, there's an article by Jeff Like, who now is well known as the director of the New England Ski Museum. But once upon a time, he was a state park ranger on top of Mount Washington and had a special interest in learning more about land titles and so forth on the mountain. And he has an article there discussing this very complex and, as an attorney might say, occasionally vexing subject.
Yeah, I know it's a topic that continues to today, trying to look back and understand that at times. Thank you for that. John asked a question that we were wondering if folks were going to ask.
Yes.
A very practical question. Where is the outhouse in 1870 on top of Mount Washington?
Well, of course, here in the 21st century, we have a different notion of delicacy, and the authors of the expedition narrative were too delicate to bring up that subject specifically. But my assumption is that given that the weather station itself only took up 1/6 of the actual depot in terms of its floor space, there was plenty of room to have kind of an indoor outhouse. And I suspect perhaps they drew straws, or whoever was the low man on the totem pole had to probably bring an occasional bucket outside somewhere. They didn't have quite the same environmental consciousness, if you will, that we have today. But human beings have to do what human beings have to do. So at least, well, the rest of the depot would have been very cold. At least it was out of the wind and the blowing snow.
Yeah, I could not imagine. There, I'm sure, a lot of creature comforts that they did not enjoy, like I know the observers do today in comparison.
Indeed, indeed.
All right. Well, some other questions. I know one certainly you can answer from Janine. Curious about work today on the summit, and she's curious, how do meteorologists get to work on the summit? I'm assuming she means today.
Sure. Well, let's see. In terms of transportation, actually, instead of today, we might say tomorrow, which is the normal shift change day on Wednesday. And during the winter time, observers go up and down, typically in a snow tractor, which I think you saw that photo of that. It's essentially like the grooming machines that you might see at ski areas, but instead of having grooming equipment, it has a passenger cab in the back. In the shoulder seasons, spring and fall, especially on the lower parts of the mountain, a rugged four-wheel drive truck with chains may be used. And during the summertime, just a regular van going up and down the Mount Washington Auto Road.
Right.
A lot easier than what those folks had 150 years ago.
Definitely in perspective, a lot easier. I know, well, not from their experience, but from modern day experience. Some great questions that I know you would certainly have some great recommendations on, Peter, from both Kevin and also Edwin. Kevin was wondering, what book or books might you recommend about Mount Washington past and present? And similarly, Edwin, one of our kilted hikers who's involved
awesome.
with Geek and supporting the observatory, is also curious specifically about any books that recount specifically the Hitchcock, the Huntington and Hitchcock expedition.
Sure. The essential reading, of course, is Mount Washington in Winter by members of the expedition. Sometimes you can find a copy of that in a used bookstore, including online, like through Amazon or ABE Books or I think A Libris. There also was a 1986 reprint of that in paperback, which would probably be more affordable, but it's great reading, even 150 years afterwards. There was also a book written by William Lowell Putnam about the history of the observatory, including the Hitchcock-Huntington expedition, called The Worst Weather on Earth. For general reading about the White Mountains and Mount Washington, there are two classics, which now I guess we might say a little dated, but since you're looking at much older history, that's not too much of a problem. One of those is Frederick Kilbourne's Chronicles of the White Mountains. Another book is by F. Allen Burt from 1960 called The Story of Mount Washington. And there are some more recent books for those who like the more grim aspects of Mount Washington. There is, of course, Nicholas Howe's Not Without Peril about fatal incidents on the mountain. There's another even more recent book looking at death on Mount Washington over the many years. And Mike Dickerman has a couple of good books on Mount Washington, in addition to some other great books about the White Mountains, some of which focus on his own experiences, and some are anthologies of some very interesting historical pieces.
Well, Peter, you're certainly the resource for book and other material recommendations, being the curator of the Observatory's fine collection of books and materials that now are being transferred into a renovated library space that we're looking forward to later on this year. So certainly for anyone looking to engage with the library materials in person, want to engage with Peter and find out more, certainly in the next few months, there's always the opportunity to come and visit the Gladys Brooks Memorial Library, though not at the moment. And certainly online at mountwashington.org. We have an online shop in which I believe we have a few of the titles you mentioned.
Well, that'd be a great opportunity. If you can't find them at our shop, feel free to look at a number of other ones. There are a number of great bookstores in the White Mountains. I think a lot of folks are familiar with our local White Birch booksellers. Steve Smith, who is an avid hiker and blogger, has the Mountain Wanderer bookshop. Mike Dickerman has a bookshop up in Littleton. So a lot of great opportunities to find new as well as historical works.
Excellent. Well, Peter, Karen asked an interesting question. She's curious what kind of wildlife was found at the summit during that time. Did the party make any mention of animal visitors, perhaps?
Just some brief mention in passing in their narrative. They referred to some mice, no surprise. And also, I think they referred to a sable. Perhaps it was an ermine or some small type of weasel. And if I recall correctly, at one point, one of the people or one of the men writing the expedition narrative said that they wanted to keep that sable unharmed because it was nice having something else living on the top of Mount Washington. So it gives you an idea of their mindset at the time. But otherwise, they seem not to have mentioned the wildlife very much at all.
Yeah, somewhat similar to today. It's a foreboding place for any living thing,
Yes.
especially during the winter.
Yes, whether 4-footed or 2-footed.
Susan asked a great question. We've been talking a lot about men and their achievements in science and exploring. She's curious about any written history of women researchers or scientists. When did women get involved in research in the area? And even I know for the observatory, a number of decades before women were a bit more commonplace on the mountain.
Yes, it's rather a shame that the typical writing, or one of the most common writings about the White Mountains, Lucy Crawford's History of the White Mountains, refers to the Mrs. Austin as being the first to hike up Mount Washington, as far as she was aware. I'm not quite sure if anyone has tracked down their first names. I hope they have by now. There are one or two books about women generally in the White Mountains or mountaineering in general, one by Rebecca Brown. Let's see, women, as far as the information in Mount Washington in winter, there's no indication that there were any women who visited that winter. But several years later, there were at least a couple of women who came up and visited the signal station in the wintertime. And there were early women naturalists, such as Annie Trumbull Slosson. And perhaps the first recognition of women at the observatory was back in the 1950s, when a woman named Nora Ridley worked part-time at the observatory. She also was working at the Summit House, so evidently she was filling in some observational shifts. And she went on to work, or rather to get her master's at Penn State University. She worked also at Blue Hill Observatory, and I believe also worked for the National Weather Service in Alaska. And nowadays, fortunately, it's quite common to find women working at the observatory. As one political figure once said, women hold up half the sky.
Thank you, Peter. Appreciate that. Lots of questions here. I know we won't be able to get to all of them, but we have lots of people who are still joining, so we'll keep going here. Gleb asks, what did the winter expedition participants eat at the summit, and how long did they stay before resupplies were hauled up?
That's a great question. There are a few mentions of their typical menu in their narrative. They did have a few special treats, for instance, Christmas Eve and Christmas Day with some canned fruit and that sort of thing. But the most typical things that they mentioned are what I might think of as typical rural northern New England food, things like hardtack, canned beef, coffee, salt pork, beans. So certainly they weren't having haute cuisine, even though they were on a high summit. And as far as resupplying, it seems that the overwhelming bulk of their material was brought up in the fall. So it had to be planned ahead. Most of it was brought up on the Cog Railroad. Unfortunately, some of their supplies and equipment came after the Cog Railroad has ceased operations for the season. And so they had to make special arrangements to use a wagon to bring things up on the carriage road. But it seems that while they made quite a few trips up and down the mountain during the winter, at least some of them did, and they had a fair number of visitors, probably more than 50 visitors total, came up to say hello to them up on top of Mount Washington. Most of what they carried was probably relatively lightweight, like the mail and so forth. So I think they mostly lived with what they had planned ahead on in the fall.
Excellent. Yeah, certainly not a lot of variation that the observers today enjoy with the weekly resupply, which I think even for most people, going a full week and making use of what you got can be a little bit of a challenge. Not as easy to go to the grocery store, but certainly much harder back then.
Oh, for sure.
Elizabeth asks a really great question. I don't really know the answer to this one, and maybe you do, but were there similar weather observatories at high elevation or in general in other countries at this time, or was this potentially a model for other observatories or weather stations elsewhere?
I'd say in many respects, the latter. It was more of a model. There were some somewhat lower elevation weather stations in Europe. And if they weren't necessarily at a lower elevation in terms of the actual altitude, in terms of their environs, in terms of being forested, or at least not in as harsh an area as you had in Mount Washington. So in some respects, Mount Washington having a weather station was really remarkable. Later, there were some other weather stations at places like Pikes Peak out in Colorado. There was one up on Ben Nevis, which also has a rather bleak summit up in Scotland. And to this day, there are still some weather stations, but they're also involved in other meteorological activities and also other physical activities, things like studying cosmic radiation and so forth in the Alps. But there aren't a lot of them around the world, in part because they're relatively expensive to maintain. When you're in a remote area with harsh weather, it's pretty tough to keep an area in operation.
Absolutely. A number of folks asking some great questions, and it certainly crosses my mind whenever I think about weather observation and measurement from years ago. But a number of folks are curious, how accurate do we think the data was that they collected using the instruments that they had at that time?
Well, I think this is a wonderful question, and really would be something for an historian of instrumentation to delve into. Perhaps the records exist. Perhaps some folks have already looked at some of those earlier records and earlier instruments. I'd say or my impression is that most meteorologists or climatologists today would tend to be a little bit skeptical of those earliest observations. Although in terms of trends, in terms of relative value, I think they're still worthwhile. For one instance, of course, the alleged minus 59 degrees for the record low of the station in 1870-71, that was noted in the book by Hitchcock and Huntington, but later, perhaps as a result of some eyebrows being raised, there was a footnote when the minus 59 was mentioned in the Geological Survey report, and that was where Hitchcock admitted that that thermometer could only be counted on to minus 38. And also, without the ability to keep ice off of an anemometer, the exposures were very limited. And as you saw in that photograph of Sergeant Smith, that anemometer is perhaps 2 or 3 feet above the ground. Nowadays, typically it's more like 30 feet above the ground to get what is considered a standard wind reading. Looking at the reports from the Signal Service, they claimed a wind of 186 miles per hour. But it's also noteworthy that many times in their station logs, they reported damage to their instruments because the instruments just weren't up to the severity of Mount Washington's winds.
Yeah, certainly lots of questions, and yeah, in some cases, I bet the measurements were quite conservative, perhaps for wind speed, perhaps for temperature, but depending on the instrument, yeah, there's not a lot of standardization, and certainly quite a bit of that happening a little bit the ways after getting into the 20th century.
Yeah.
Well, Peter, thank you so much for answering all these questions, and for everyone who's submitted questions. This is by far the most questions we've had for a program, so apologies. I know we won't be able to get to any more for this evening. If you still have a question, a burning question that we weren't able to get to, please email us over at education@mountwashington.org. That's one way to get in touch, or you can search through the website mountwashington.org to our general contact us email. But education@mountwashington.org. Be happy to get some questions over to Peter if you think of some after the program this evening as well. So Peter, thank you so much again for presenting this evening, for so casually just swapping computers with me and working through all of that. I really appreciate that. For everyone else, thank you as well. If you enjoyed tonight's program, I'd strongly encourage you to become a member of the Observatory if you're not one already, and or consider making a donation toward this free program over at mountwashington.org. While you're there, you can check out our upcoming programs for Science of the Mountains. On March 16th, we will have Dan Burke, the Warning Coordination Meteorologist at the National Weather Service Forecast Office in Las Vegas, Nevada. He will be talking about the other end of the thermometer, weather at the hottest place on Earth, and Death Valley, the climate of Death Valley, the measurements in Death Valley, and in fact, how to verify world record temperatures that are set there as well. So hope you'll join us for that. And on April 13th at 7 p.m., we will have Whether or Not, Understanding the Higher Summits Forecast, and that'll be with author and risk professional Ty Gagney and senior meteorologist and weather observer Ryan Knapp from Mount Washington Observatory. And they'll be speaking about how to interpret the Higher Summits Forecast, how it comes together, and how to use that environmental data and information to make risk-based decisions in the backcountry. So you can sign up for those programs over at mountwashington.org/SITM. And you can also watch any of the recorded programs you might have missed there as well. So thanks so much. Thanks again, Peter, for presenting this evening. Thanks all for joining. Have a wonderful night, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Night. Bye-bye.